Hey everybody, welcome back. I hope that your spring break was awesome. Um, we're starting a new chapter. Well, actually, I apologize, thinking of the wrong class. We're continuing our chapter, so hopefully you watched the one from the week before spring break. If you did not, please go back and do that now. I noticed a lot of you didn't do the homework, so it could be that some of you took spring break early. So make sure to do that before you do this. So let's just go ahead and get started. We talked about last time the 7 factors of the economy and how they can impact individual pieces kind of make up the whole of the economy, if that makes sense. And so we're going to look at these things for each region individually. So we'll start with the Northeast. So this is what we used to call New England, right? Um, Basically, as new states started to be added, we have to kind of change how we think of different regions of the country. Different areas start to have more in common. Like some of our newer states have more in common with certain parts of the country than others. So we don't really think of it as just New England anymore, in the middle colonies and the southern colonies. We start to change that to the Northeast, the South, and the West a lot more. So immigration starts adding a lot of people to the labor force in the Northeast. If people were coming to the United States, most of those people actually settled in the Northeast. Most did not settle in the South because they didn't have money to invest in buying a plantation and slaves to compete with their neighbors. So most of them were coming and working in factories in the Northeast. About 6 million immigrants came in just 40 years, all to the Northeast. That's a huge number even today, but for that time period, it's a lot more. Even with this huge amount of people coming in, though, sometimes factories had a hard time getting enough workers, which sounds crazy. A lot of workers actually started forming what's called trade unions. These would be groups that would negotiate on behalf of their workers to try and get them better living conditions, raises, things like that. So here's a really crazy, busy dock, people coming and going. So natural resources in the Northeast were pretty good in some areas, but not in others. So there's some good farmland in the Northeast, but not enough for everyone to have a job in farming. Some of the most important natural resources, though, were iron, coal, and river water. River water normally would be for drinking, but in this case, it was actually a way to stimulate the economy. River water was actually used to power factories and other things. Think about water wheels, right? That helped power a lot of these factories. Here's a water wheel. Oh, it's pretty. Some of the most important improvements in equipment and tools for the Northeast were actually those that had to do with the textile industry. Remember, textile means cloth. So this was where we were taking cotton from the South, taking it to the North, and then putting it in these factories and turning it into actual usable cloth. In 1813, the power loom came to the United States. It actually came illegally. The British had patented it, and they'd actually tried to force anyone who knew anything about power looms to not leave the country. There was actually a Scottish gentleman who came to the United States, and a bunch of American companies, he like snuck out of the United Kingdom. A bunch of American companies bribed him to tell them how power looms worked. And so we kind of stole that idea. But basically it uses water power to move components inside of the factory that helps speed up the process of making cloth. So it's not all done by hand anymore. You can produce a lot more cloth a lot faster with the power loom. Here's a drawing of one. So you can see all these turbines, these spinny things at the top on the ceiling there. That was powered by the water wheel. And then those cables coming down, those, I guess they're not cables. What's the word I'm looking for? Dang it. Normally when you guys are in the classroom, you can help me find my words. Gosh. Not ribbon. It's a big, thick. Anyway, whatever. So these strips of cloth of really thick ropes and things would actually then spin, and they would turn components on individual machines. Pretty cool. One water wheel powering this whole thing. All right. So transportation was a big deal in the Northeast too. One of the big things that they needed to do was to create canals. One of the reasons that rivers are so powerful in the Northeast actually has to do with waterfalls. There's some really quick rivers in the Northeast that really power water wheels really well, but they're not great for transportation. It makes it so it's impossible to get around some of these rivers unless you build a canal. So a lot of these rivers actually needed to have canals built on them to improve transportation. And so canals became a big thing that helped improve transportation, especially in the Northeast. Remember, canals are man-made rivers. They connect one place to another. Sometimes it's because you want the water from one place to another. Sometimes it's because you want to be able to go around an obstacle with a boat. In this case, we're talking about getting around an obstacle. In Utah, though, a lot of our canals are too small for boats. They're just trying to get water from a river to a farm, right? Kind of like the one that runs right past the school. So here's a famous canal that was built, the Erie Canal. Connects the Great Lakes to the ocean, which is important. All right, another big thing that helped with transportation is actually the development of the steam engine. Steam engines were these huge, huge engines that couldn't be used in something like a car, but could be used in a train or in a factory or in a boat. These steam engines basically work by boiling water and then using that steam to move a piston, which then moves something else that it's connected to. In the case of a boat or a train, you'd be moving a wheel, whether that wheel is on a rail or whether that wheel is in the water. Doesn't really matter, but the process is the same. So this is a huge thing for the Northeast. It really helps because it makes it so that you can travel upriver a lot easier and you don't need wind anymore. You aren't reliant on weather to move. Of course, bad weather makes it harder still, but you don't have to rely on wind anymore. Trains would then actually also open up other places. So at this point, if there wasn't a river somewhere, it was really difficult to travel to and from that area. But now with trains, it's like having a river anywhere. You just have to build it first. These railroads become a huge, huge important thing that we'll be talking about a lot more later. So here's a steamboat. It's a newer one, but and then you have a steam train at the bottom right. This diagram can show you kind of how the steam engine works. So you have basically you're boiling water and it pushes steam through these pipes, which then move. You can kind of see this silvery piece here. When that steam comes in, the pressure from that will push it here. The steam will escape underneath and go out here. And then when that escapes, the piston then has, there's not enough pressure over here anymore, so it pulls it back. So this whole piece then is then moving back and forth, which you have connected to something else, which is then moved, usually a wheel for most steam engines. So you can see right down here, that's where that would connect to these wheels here. So the steam engine's up here and it's connecting to these wheels. So as that piston moves, it's rotating the wheel around and moving you forward. Pretty cool. At first, there were not a lot of banks that would loan money to American businesses because you were afraid that an American business was going to do poorly. They were afraid, banks were afraid that Americans wouldn't pay back their money. And so a lot of these loans were difficult to get. But the Boston Manufacturing Company actually started producing a lot of cotton cloth and made huge amounts of profit. And so then banks saw that it could happen in America. Companies could make a ton of money in the United States. And so more and more banks were open to lending money to American businesses after that. Thanks, Boston Manufacturing Company. This is actually one of their factories. One cool thing to notice is, again, this is before electricity. And how many of you want to have a ton of lanterns inside of a cloth factory? Doesn't sound like a great idea, right? So they actually made their buildings really thin and narrow to take advantage of as much sunlight as possible, so that you could actually, if it was a sunny day, the lighting was good enough in the entire building. If the building had been really wide, then you would have parts in the middle that would never get sunlight, and so you always have to have lanterns there, which is dangerous. So kind of a cool design that they made right next to the river where they would have had, this whole thing here, this looks like a bridge, and it is in a way, but it's the walkway on top is just so you can actually maintain the water wheel here. This is actually a water wheel that's inside of this bridge, which is kind of cool. That wasn't around at first, but it was a later invention. So, all right, so populations were growing really, really big in the Northeast. And they were becoming more and more reliant on working in factories. So they weren't providing their own food at all anymore in the Northeast. Remember, before they weren't producing enough food for themselves anyway, but now they're producing even less food. So they need a lot of items from elsewhere, and they didn't make any of these items themselves. So there was a really high demand for American products, both inside of the United States and outside, because it was actually found that most American companies were producing really good stuff. So we were producing things that were just as good as what you could get in England, but for a lot cheaper because you didn't have to pay the transportation costs. And so American products, if you could make it, you could usually sell it to somebody. All right, now profit. More and more manufacturing was happening in the United States, which is great because what happens when you buy from another country, you are sending part of your money to that country, and that company there is benefiting, but also the neighboring companies are benefiting because that company is going to spend those profits either by building a new factory or by investing in something in that neighborhood, or just because the owners are going to spend money on mansions or whatever, right? That's going to stimulate their economy, not ours, right? So as more and more of our manufacturing is happening in the United States, more and more of that money is being reinvested in the United States, which is really great for a lot of things. So profits continue to rise because of this, which is great for basically everybody. Buy American. We should still try and do this, especially right now. One big story from this time period is actually young women started working in factories. Before this, women were not really out in the workforce. Some women did work at home type things where, so like in the South, for example, you might take cotton fibers. Instead of sending them up to the north to have them turned into cotton there, some women at home would actually spin yarn out of it themselves and then sell that yarn to somebody else. So they would just get cotton and spin it in their home and then sell it to somebody. That was about the extent of women working for the most part. There's very, very few women in the workplace. This started to change, especially for young women. I mean, young women at this point, we were just being trained to get married, basically. Trained to cook and clean and take care of a family so that you could start your own family. But some young women were actually hired in some New England textile mills in the 1820s through 1840. Basically, they were paid pretty low wages, but housing was provided for them in dormitories. These dormitories would actually set up special events. They would actually invite boys from the neighborhood for dances. That was, but otherwise boys weren't allowed there. And they actually kind of gave schooling to some of the girls, a basic schooling, not like high school, but tried to finish the education for some of these girls. But most of their wages were actually sent home to their families. So basically the family benefits because they don't have another mouth to feed at home, but they're also getting the wages from some of the wages from that girl. That young lady benefits because she is making her own money. She's able to buy things on her own. So for a lot of young women, especially from poorer families, this was a huge opportunity. And this is really the first generation of women who worked outside of the home and were providing for themselves independently. However, in the 1840s, a lot of these young women were actually replaced by immigrants, largely Irishmen, who came and they were willing to work for basically the same wage, but the company didn't have to provide these dormitories. They didn't have to provide social events. So it was a lot cheaper for the companies to just replace the young women with these immigrants. But it does kind of start the ball rolling for women working outside of the home. And that is it for today. Make sure to do your homework and submit that to me through the Google Classroom. And I hope you have a great day. Thanks, guys.